GGG are surely releasing the new batch of Foulborn Unique items any moment now, right guys? Now regardless of that, I want to do another video discussing more of these items because I think they're absolutely awesome, and I hope that by the end of this league they find a way to go core into the game in some way. But let's just get straight into it, beginning with the Foulborn version of Frost Breath. Now, Frost Breath as a weapon has always been quite a good sort of mid-level or entry-level budget option in some attack builds, and even in some builds this is the best in-slot weapon. For example, Garatha's Glacial Hammer Juggernaut from a few patches back used this weapon along with trauma support, and you basically couldn't replace it with anything else. That's because of this modifier on the weapon right here. Attacks with this weapon deal double damage to chilled enemies. Now with an attack like Glacial Hammer, there's no problem there because you're already dealing cold damage, but it doesn't actually matter what type of damage you're dealing with a mace when it comes to Frost Breath, because the Mace Mastery has a modifier right here. All damage with maces and scepters inflicts chill, so you can use any damage type with maces and you'll be able to inflict chill, and therefore you can benefit from the modifier on Frost Breath. Now in this patch you can obtain a Foulborn version of this item which replaces the increased attack speed modifier with increased critical strike chance. And this is of course a local increased crit chance modifier, so it's going to scale the base 5% crit chance on that weapon. And this is no small crit chance modifier, 60 to 100%. At 100% increased crit chance, you will have a 10% base critical strike chance mace. That is almost unheard of. And I wanted to highlight this weapon for one particular interaction, that is Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, which is an attack which essentially attacks with both of your weapons at once. And how that attack works is the transfigured version. It deals more damage with your main hand weapon, but then the entire attack speed of the whole attack is based on your offhand weapon. So your main hand attack speed is actually discarded and it focuses on your offhand weapon instead. And therefore you can use Frost Breath in the main hand and benefit from that double damage modifier and that up to 10% base crit, along with a really fast attack speed offhand, and be able to basically benefit from that massive increased crit chance modifier there that you can gain on the Foulborn version without even worrying about any of the downside that comes with this loss of increased attack speed. And that then enables you to do something which a trauma stacking setup hasn't really been able to do in the past, which is go crit. Usually these builds just have a 5% base crit weapon, they can't really splash into crit at all, but with a 10% base crit weapon, you're going to be able to go absolutely crazy into crit there, and you'll be able to scale that up. And in that particular setup, you can just imagine how much damage you're going to be dealing. You have the more damage multiplier coming in there from Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, then you have the double damage mod from Frost Breath itself, and then you have the critical strike multiplier on top, and then you have all of your more damage multipliers from your support gems and other things like that. That is a ton of damage just waiting to happen right there with that combination. So I wanted to highlight that one because I think that's really, really powerful in this current patch. And next up we have the Foulborn version of Maligaro's Restraint. Now this is a belt that's not used all that often outside of some kind of niche, like gimmicky setups where you want to reflect shock back to yourself to cause a particular interaction. But in the current patch you can get a Foulborn version of this which has 40% of lightning damage converted to chaos damage. Now that stat on its own is not particularly useful, but if you take into account the fact that in this patch we got bloodlines, and we actually have the Lycia bloodline which has the node Sinner's Saint, which has 50% of lightning damage converted to chaos damage. And on top of that, you can actually scale this belt up to 48% with catalysts, which would mean at that point you have 98% of your lightning damage converted to chaos damage. Now, at that point you can actually make use of modifiers that scale chaos damage rather than lightning damage, and one of the most notable ones there is Wither, and Wither is basically just a better version of Shock. It makes targets take increased chaos damage specifically, and it stacks up to 15, and at 15 stacks of Wither you have 90% increased chaos damage taken, and you can even scale that there with Wither effects as well to make it even stronger. And on top of that, you can also benefit from the fact that usually monsters have lower chaos resistance compared to elemental resistance. For example, pinnacle bosses have 50% elemental resistances, but they only have 30% chaos resistance. So along with the Despair Curse, along with that Wither application, you're going to be able to deal a lot more damage converting your damage to chaos than you would have been able to do with lightning damage. And you can do this with any lightning damage based skill, whether it's a spell or an attack or anything like that. And there's also the other modifiers on Maligaro's here, which basically makes you stronger when you have shock applied to you. However, keep in mind that if you're converting 98% of your damage to chaos, you're basically not going to be shocking unless you shock with that 2% of lightning damage. So if you do shock, it's likely to be a very small shock, in which case you can benefit from these modifiers here, the 60% increased damage while shocked and the 15% increased movement speed while shocked, without having much of any increased damage taken on yourself. Alternatively, you can use something like Void Manipulation support so that you don't deal any elemental damage, therefore you wouldn't be able to shock. Or you can use Elemental Focus, since you're doing base elemental damage converted to chaos, and then you would essentially keep all of your damage and you'd still scale that damage with the more multiplier, but you wouldn't be able to inflict elemental ailments, and therefore you can't inflict shock, so you can't reflect it back to yourself. Now let's move on to a unique helmet, Devoto's Devotion. And this item has been pretty bad ever since the addition of Spell Suppression, and then the following patch after that was the addition of Eldritch Implicits, and those things combined have kind of phased this item out of existence. So this one has increased attack speed, it has a good roll of chaos resistance there, it also has increased movement speed and some dexterity. It's got generally good stats. There is a 10% reduced global physical damage roll there, but that is additive with your increases, so it's not really too much to write home about. But in this patch, you can actually get some modifiers that make it somewhat competitive with crafted helmets. First, there's this 10 to 20% chance to suppress spell damage. Now, a tier 1 roll on a crafted helmet goes up to 14% chance to suppress spell damage. So at 20%, you have an extra 6% spell suppression. That might save you a point on the passive tree, or it could free up some slots on your gear elsewhere. So that is actually a really strong modifier there with up to 20% chance. That one does replace the dexterity, which might be a bit of a loss there for some builds because that is a very high dexterity roll, but 20% is a lot of spell suppression chance from a single helmet. But the other one that I want to highlight there is the other Foulborn modifier, which is 20% increased attack speed with movement skills. Now this does remove the 20% movement speed modifier, but there are a lot of movement skills that can benefit a lot from this, and do keep in mind that Devoto's Devotion already has 16% increased attack speed on it, so that means that this item will be providing 36% increased attack speed for movement skills specifically. And there's a lot of good movement skills. For example, Cyclone is a movement skill, as is the Transfigured Cyclone of Tumult. You also have Flicker Strike and the Transfigured Flicker Strike of Power. Those skills are both movement skills as well. They can benefit from that increased attack speed. You have things like Consecrated Path, which has the movement tag there as well. And even Leap Slam and Shield Charge. Just using this helmet with those will make you move around a lot faster if you're using Leap Slam as your movement skill, or Shield Charge, or perhaps you're using Leap Slam of Groundbreaking as your damage skill. That could be an interesting interaction there because you gain so much increased attack speed from that Foulborn helmet. So the idea there of combining both of these Transfigure modifiers together on that helmet actually makes it quite competitive for those particular builds there using those movement skills. Now let's move on to Gifts from Above, which is a unique ring, and this ring isn't used very often at all, and it's a ring that's all about Consecrated Ground and critical strikes. But the reason why I wanted to highlight this ring is because it has 25 to 40% increased effect of Consecrated Ground you create. Now that's a very rare modifier, you basically don't see that at all. There is one node on the tree that grants that, and it provides 25% of that stat. So if you were to use two of these rings together, and you gained the Devotion node on the passive tree there, which is right next to the Templar start location, so perfect for an Inquisitor, then you would have over 100% increased effect of Consecrated Ground. And that would mean that the Consecrated Ground that you create would regenerate 10% life per second, because it normally regenerates 5, and it would reduce the effect of curses on you by 100%, because that usually provides 50% reduced curse effect. So you would essentially be immune to curses, and you would have a ton of recovery on top of that, and if you're an Inquisitor, you always have Consecrated Ground around you, because you have this node here which grants it while stationary, and then you have this one which makes it so that it lingers for 4 seconds, and on top of that, that 10% life regeneration would also be applying to your energy shield, so that is a really strong combination you could use there. That is both of your ring slots, of course, which is no small trade-off, but I still wanted to highlight that regardless, because I think you get quite a lot out of this on an Inquisitor. And do keep in mind there that the other modifiers on that ring, the 50% increased damage while on Consecrated Ground and the 5% chance to block attack damage, those would not scale with Consecrated Ground effect because they're not worded correctly. For that, they would need to be worded, for example, Consecrated Ground you create also grants 50% increased damage, but that's not how they're worded, so they will not scale with that stat. Now lastly in this video, I wanted to discuss Ancestral Vision. We have a couple of different versions of this item in terms of the Foulborn modifiers, and Ancestral Vision is a jewel that's been very good ever since it was added to the game, because it makes half of your spell suppression chance be applied to chance to avoid elemental ailments. So if you have a build that's capped out on spell suppression chance, you'll gain 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments, and then you can just gain the other 50% from other areas. For example, your boots is the most common place to get that from, and then you can also have full elemental ailment avoidance. Now in this patch you can have that modifier replaced by a modifier that grants chance to suppress spell damage, also applies to chance to defend with 200% of armor at 100% of their value. This 100% number here is actually incorrect, it's actually 50% in game, which is true for some of the other modifiers here on PoEDB, you need to be a little bit careful, but that one is 50%. So how this modifier works is, let's say you roll successfully with this modifier to defend with 200% of armor. That means that the incoming hit would be mitigated as though you had double armor. So 200% of your armor number will be applied to that calculation for calculating the amount of damage reduction that is actually provided for that hit. Now you can actually stack this up to 100%. Let's say you do have 100% chance to suppress spell damage, therefore you'd be gaining 50% chance to defend with 200% of armor. You can then go over here and you can make use of an Elder Belt, which is rolling up to 30% chance to defend with 200% of armor. That one is also scaled with Catalyst, so you don't necessarily need to get exactly 30%. Then you can add that to the Armor Mastery right here, which is 20% chance to defend with 200% of armor, at which point you would have 100% chance to defend with 200% of armor. Alternatively, you can make use of the Dragon Hunter notable there on the Armor Small Cluster Jewels, and that one provides 15% chance to defend with 200% of armor. So for example, you could replace the belt there with 2 of these, and that would provide you with the same amount to be able to reach 100%. And once you actually have 100% chance to defend with 200% of armor, that would mean that every incoming hit which interacts with your armor, which is usually just physical damage, but it might be elemental damage if you're using something like Transcendence, well, that will treat every single one of those hits as if you had double armor. So every hit will be mitigated as if you had twice your normal armor. And do keep in mind that it only relates to defending against hits. It doesn't work for things like Molten Shell. It won't scale your Molten Shell by twice your armor. But that is still a very, very powerful modifier. And the other thing I wanted to highlight here on Ancestral Vision is the other Foulborn modifiers, particularly this one right here. 5 to 10% chance to suppress spell damage. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to remember that this is 5 to 10% chance to suppress spell damage on a jewel. So this is going to appear on a jewel slot. And that means that this is very, very good, particularly on builds on the left side of the tree that find it very hard to cap spell suppression. Usually what those builds do is they path up here to Magebane, they come from this kind of left area here, or they come from the area up here, and they path all the way down through this middle Scion section, and they get to Magebane to make their dexterity scaling also scale their chance to suppress spell damage, and they also take reflexes while they're there, and they might use their Anoint to Anoint Inveterate. That's how they kind of get a lot of extra spell suppression there to be able to reach 100%. But in those kinds of builds, they are still extremely limited by what gear they can use, because they still have to make the rest of the spell suppression chance up from their gear slots. And you might find that that 5 to 10% chance there is enough to allow you to have a little bit more freedom when it comes to different gear slots. So that is incredibly powerful on a jewel, especially if you can get this one right here in combination with either of these two modifiers here, because both of these are very good in their own right. If you're scaling spell suppression already to be able to get 100% chance to suppress spell damage, you're then able to also scale your chance to avoid elemental ailments, which is exceptionally good on its own. Or if you're already scaling armor, for example, those builds coming from that lower left quadrant of the tree there, those kind of Marauder builds, you know, those Bone Shatter and Earth Shatter builds and things like that, they're already going to be scaling armor, so being able to stack this on top of that spell suppression chance is really, really good. But that is pretty much it for this video. Another round of Foulborn Unique items. Hopefully we're getting more of them soon. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.